The Quantum Guardian, Rise of the Angel. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Ethan Cross's high-rise apartment, casting soft rays across the sleek, polished floors. The room was quiet, except for the distant hum of city life below. Ethan stood by the window, sipping his coffee, gazing out at the sprawling skyline. His apartment was modern, clean, and minimal, a reflection of his life. Everything in its place. Nothing too extravagant, but everything well chosen. The type of apartment you'd expect from someone successful, but grounded. Ethan was 27, young by most standards, but already a lead quantum architect at QuantumCore Technologies. Despite his age, he had a sharp mind, a natural talent for understanding the complexities of quantum systems, and a drive that kept him pushing forward. Today felt like any other day, though. The routine was comfortable, mornings spent in quiet reflection, followed by the drive to work, and hours spent in a world that very few could comprehend. He glanced at the clock, 7:45 a.m. Then, his eyes caught the date on the calendar hanging nearby, March 18th, 2035. The future he had always imagined was already here, and he was at the forefront of shaping it. But for now, it was almost time to leave. He took another sip of coffee, savoring the calm before the storm of the day ahead. A knock at the door broke the silence. Ethan smiled to himself. He knew who it was even before he answered. He opened the door to find Mrs. Green standing there, as she did most mornings. She was an older woman, probably in her late 60s, with a warmth that radiated from her. She lived 2 doors down and had taken a liking to Ethan ever since he'd moved in. Always ready with a smile, always with a kind word. "Morning, Ethan," Mrs. Green said, her voice bright and cheerful. "Just wanted to check in on you before you head off to that big fancy job of yours. QuantumCore, right? You still working on all that quantum, whatever it is?" Ethan chuckled. "Quantum computing and energy systems, Mrs. Green. But yes, still at it." "Well, I can't pretend to understand any of it, but I'm sure you're doing something wonderful. Just don't forget to eat lunch, all right? You young people get so wrapped up in your work, you forget the basics," she said, wagging her finger playfully. "I won't forget. Thanks, Mrs. Green." "You're a good boy, Ethan. The world could use more like you," she said with a wink before turning to shuffle back down the hallway. "You have a good day now." Ethan smiled as he closed the door, her words lingering in the quiet of his apartment. He didn't consider himself all that special, just driven, but her kindness was always appreciated. He grabbed his keys, slipped into his jacket, and stepped into the hallway, locking the door behind him. The elevator ride down was quiet, save for the faint sound of jazz playing through the speakers. It was part of his morning routine, a calming moment before the busy day ahead. Outside, the city greeted him with the usual sights and sounds. People heading to work, cars flowing through the streets, the hum of life in constant motion. Ethan's car sat waiting in the parking garage below, sleek, efficient, just like everything else in his life. As he slid into the driver's seat, he let his mind drift. The drive to QuantumCore was familiar, the same route every day, but his thoughts often wandered back to those who had influenced his journey. Growing up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Ethan had been surrounded by the quiet charm of a small town with deep roots in scientific history. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory had always been a beacon of innovation in his childhood, sparking his early interest in science and technology. But it wasn't just curiosity that had driven him into the world of quantum computing. There had been a tragedy, one that still lingered in the corners of his mind, even now. A family member, someone close to him, had been lost too soon. The details of that day were etched into his memory, though he tried not to dwell on them. If only the technology he imagined could have existed back then, if only he could have developed the ideas that burned in his mind, maybe they could have been saved. That loss had been the catalyst, the spark that pushed Ethan beyond the limits of ordinary ambition. He had made a promise to himself, even as a teenager, that he would create the future. Not just for the thrill of discovery, but to ensure that others wouldn't have to endure the same loss. If he could harness the untapped potential of quantum energy, perhaps he could build a world where technology could heal, protect, and change lives. But for now, those dreams remained just out of reach. QuantumCore Technologies towered ahead, its gleaming glass structure a symbol of the future Ethan had always imagined. As he pulled into the parking lot, he glanced up at the building, feeling a sense of purpose swell within him. He wasn't just working a job, he was part of something far greater, pushing the boundaries of what was possible, striving for breakthroughs that could reshape the world. Inside, the familiar buzz of activity greeted him. QuantumCore was a hub of constant innovation, with researchers and engineers working tirelessly on the cutting edge of science. Ethan made his way through the sleek, modern lobby, nodding to a few familiar faces as he passed. Most of his colleagues were brilliant minds, people who lived and breathed the same ambitions as he did. But Ethan had always felt a step ahead, even among them. He stepped into the elevator, ascending to the 10th floor, where the real work began. As the door slid open, he was greeted by Dr. Sarah Hale, one of QuantumCore's lead researchers and one of his closest colleagues. Sarah was sharp, focused, and always on top of her game. "Morning, Cross," Sarah said, holding a coffee cup in one hand and a tablet in the other. "Ready for another day of breaking the laws of physics?" Ethan smirked. "You know me, always looking to bend the rules a little." Sarah grinned. "Well, you'll be happy to know that the higher-ups want us to move forward on that quantum compression project. Big meeting today. You might want to be prepared for some ambitious expectations." "I'm always ready for ambitious expectations," Ethan said, stepping into stride with her as they made their way down the hallway. "As long as they're realistic." "Realistic? Where's the fun in that?" Sarah teased. "But seriously, we're on the brink of something huge. If we pull this off..." "I know," Ethan said, his mind already racing with the possibilities. Quantum compression could be the key to unlocking new realms of energy storage and manipulation, technology that could revolutionize everything from medical devices to global power grids. But with every breakthrough came new challenges and new risks. As they walked, Ethan glanced into the various labs, catching glimpses of the advanced equipment and experiments underway. Quantum energy pulses flickered in some of the labs, while others were filled with rows of computers and servers, processing mountains of data in real time. This was the frontier of human understanding, and Ethan was at the heart of it. Sarah stopped outside her office, turning to face Ethan. "By the way, rumor has it we've got some fresh recruits coming in, straight from the universities. Think you're ready to mentor the next generation of quantum prodigies?" Ethan chuckled. "Mentor? Me? I think I've still got a few things to learn myself." "Don't sell yourself short, Cross. You've got more to offer than you think," she said with a knowing smile before heading into her office. Ethan stood there for a moment, her words hanging in the air. He was at the top of his field, but the journey to get here had been anything but easy, and there were still things he couldn't shake. The memories of his past, the loss that had shaped him, and the dreams that still felt so far away. For now, though, there was work to be done. Ethan sat down at his desk, the hum of his office familiar and calming. The large window behind him offered a view of the city stretching far beyond the QuantumCore campus. The building was modern, filled with sleek surfaces, glass walls, and quiet efficiency. But inside, the air buzzed with ideas, plans, and innovations that could change the world. His desk was organized, not cluttered with paperwork like some of his colleagues. Instead, digital tablets and holographic displays rested neatly in front of him, waiting for him to dive into the day's work. As the holographic interface flickered to life, Ethan swiped through several project updates. The quantum compression project was at the top of the list. The technology they were working on was groundbreaking, to say the least. If they could stabilize the quantum energy they were compressing, they could unlock an entirely new form of energy storage, limitless, clean power in a fraction of the space. It was the kind of project that could revolutionize industries across the globe. But that was the problem with breaking new ground. The risks were enormous. Every time they ran the simulations, the outcomes were uncertain, volatile even. Ethan's mind wandered to the upcoming meeting. The higher-ups were eager for results, but pushing too fast in this field had its dangers. He knew the team was close to a breakthrough, but they still needed time. And time, in the corporate world, was often a luxury they didn't have. A knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Sarah, her tablet in hand, leaning against the doorframe. "Ready for the big show?" she asked, her tone light, but with an underlying seriousness. "As ready as I'll ever be," Ethan replied, "just hoping they don't expect miracles today." Sarah stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. She gave him a knowing smile, sitting on the edge of his desk. "You know they always expect miracles." "That's the problem," Ethan muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're close, but I don't think they understand how delicate this is. One wrong move, and we're looking at catastrophic energy surges." "I know," Sarah said, her voice softer now. "But we've got this. We've been careful, methodical. If we push forward with the next phase, we'll get results, just not the lightning in a bottle they want." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, but explaining that to them is like explaining quantum mechanics to a 5-year-old. They hear the words but don't grasp the complexity." She smirked. "That's why they pay you the big bucks, right?" He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Right." Sarah stood, her demeanor shifting slightly. "Anyway, let's get this over with. Afterward, we can grab lunch and debrief before diving back into the lab." Ethan nodded again, pushing himself up from his chair. "Let's do this." The conference room was large, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city below. A group of executives sat around the glass table, their expressions a mix of interest and impatience. Ethan and Sarah took their seats at the far end of the table, their tablets resting in front of them as the meeting began. The CEO of QuantumCore, William Lennox, was a tall, commanding figure with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. He stood at the head of the table, his presence enough to make even the most confident researchers tread carefully. "Thank you all for coming," Lennox began, his voice calm but firm. "I've been hearing a lot of promising updates about the quantum compression project. We're hoping today's meeting will give us a clearer picture of where we stand." He turned his gaze toward Ethan and Sarah. "Mr. Cross, Dr. Hale, I understand you've been leading this effort. Why don't you give us the rundown?" Ethan took a breath, steadying himself. He had done this countless times before, presenting complex scientific breakthroughs to people who didn't fully understand the science behind them. But it never got easier. "The quantum compression project is progressing well," Ethan began, his tone measured. "We've successfully managed to compress quantum energy in controlled environments, but the key challenge has been maintaining stability at higher energy levels. We've been running simulations to predict energy flow patterns and prevent system overloads. So far, the data is promising, but we need more time to ensure that the energy remains stable in real-world conditions." Lennox's expression didn't change, but Ethan could sense the impatience. "How much more time are we talking about?" Ethan hesitated for a moment. "A few more weeks, maybe a month. The potential for instability is still too high to push forward without further testing." The room was silent for a beat, the tension palpable. Lennox exchanged glances with some of the other executives before speaking again. "I understand the need for caution, but we're working on tight deadlines here. We've got investors breathing down our necks, and they expect results. What can we deliver in the short term?" Sarah stepped in smoothly, her voice calm and reassuring. "We can push forward with a limited-scale test, something controlled to demonstrate progress without the risk of a full-scale trial. That should give us enough data to refine the process and move forward more confidently." Lennox considered this for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I want a controlled test by the end of the week. I expect updates daily." Ethan and Sarah exchanged a glance, knowing the pressure had just been cranked up another notch. But it wasn't unexpected. They had been walking this tightrope for months now. "We'll make it happen," Sarah said confidently, though Ethan could feel the weight of her words hanging between them. After the meeting, Ethan and Sarah walked silently down the hallway toward the lab. The tension from the meeting still lingered, and neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "You think we're ready for a controlled test?" Ethan sighed. "We don't have much of a choice, do we? If we stall any longer, they'll bring in someone else to push it through." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "I just don't want to rush this. You're right, there's too much at stake." Ethan stopped walking and turned to her. "Look, we'll do the test, but we do it our way. Controlled, safe, and with every precaution in place. I'm not willing to risk everything just because they're impatient." Sarah nodded. "Agreed." They resumed walking, the pressure of the looming deadline hanging over them like a storm cloud. Ethan's mind raced with calculations, possibilities, and the constant fear of failure. He knew what was at stake, not just for the company, but for the future of quantum technology itself. As they entered the lab, the familiar hum of machinery greeted them. Screens flickered with data, and the energy pulses from the quantum cores created a soft glow that filled the room. Ethan stepped toward the main console, where the quantum compression system was housed. For a moment, he stood there, staring at the system they had worked so hard to build. It was the future: power, efficiency, and limitless potential, all compressed into a single device. But it was also dangerous, unpredictable, and filled with unknowns. Sarah joined him at the console, her voice low. "You all right?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. His thoughts drifted back to the reason he had pushed himself so hard, the promise he had made to himself years ago. If this worked, it wouldn't just be a breakthrough for QuantumCore. It would be a breakthrough for the world, for people like his family member, for those who had been lost too soon. "I will be," he finally said, his voice steady. "We're going to make this work." Sarah smiled slightly, her eyes reflecting the glow of the quantum core. "Yeah, we are." The day stretched on, filled with preparations, calculations, and simulations. The weight of the upcoming test bore down on Ethan, but as the hours passed, he found himself slipping into the rhythm of the work. This was what he was good at: solving problems, finding solutions, and pushing the limits of what was possible. But there was a part of him, deep down, that couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something big. Whether it was the pressure of the project or the memories of the past, he couldn't be sure. But as the day drew to a close, and he stood in the empty lab, staring at the softly glowing quantum core, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The next few days were a blur of preparations. Ethan and Sarah spent nearly every waking hour in the lab, running simulations, reviewing data, and making adjustments to the quantum compression system. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized from years of collaboration. Ethan appreciated how easily they communicated. No need for long explanations or justifications. Sarah understood the work as well as he did, and that made her not just a colleague, but a true partner in their pursuit of something greater. Late one evening, long after the other researchers had gone home, Ethan and Sarah were still in the lab, poring over the latest results. The hum of the machines was the only sound, a steady rhythm that matched the focus in the room. "Looks like the energy stabilization matrix is holding better than expected," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the screen in front of her. "We might actually be ready for this test." Ethan glanced over at her, appreciating the optimism in her voice. "If it holds like this during the live run, we're in good shape, but we can't ignore the outliers from the last simulation. The variance in energy flux still concerns me." Sarah nodded, scrolling through the data. "We'll keep it tightly controlled. I've already input the emergency shutdown protocols. If anything goes off course, we pull the plug immediately." Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The pressure was mounting, Lennox had made it clear that the test needed to happen by the end of the week, and while the system looked stable now, there was always the chance that something unexpected could happen. Sarah glanced at him, sensing his unease. "You're not going to let this eat at you, are you? We've got this." He sighed, dropping his hands into his lap. "I know, it's not just about getting the test right. If this works, we're talking about changing everything. It's bigger than QuantumCore, bigger than us." Sarah sat back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "You've been pushing yourself harder than usual lately. What's really going on?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze drifting to the glowing quantum core in the center of the lab. The soft blue light pulsed steadily, a reminder of the power they were playing with. He hadn't talked much about the deeper reasons behind his drive, why this project in particular mattered so much to him. But if there was anyone he trusted with that part of himself, it was Sarah. "When I was younger, I lost my mother," he said quietly. "She got sick, and back then, there was nothing anyone could do. If we had the kind of technology we're developing now, I know it could have saved her. I couldn't help her then, but I've spent every day since trying to make sure that no one else has to go through that. I'm not just working on this project to push the boundaries of science. It's personal." Sarah listened, her expression softening. She knew Ethan was driven, but hearing this gave her new insight into just how personal his mission was. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said after a moment. "I didn't know." Ethan gave a small nod. "I don't talk about it much, but that's why this matters to me. It's not just about the science or the breakthroughs. It's about making sure that the things we couldn't do back then become possible now." Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady but filled with understanding. "I get it. I've lost people too, and I know that drive. It's hard to let go of the what-ifs, but you've already made more of a difference than you think. We both have." Ethan looked at her, grateful for her words. Sarah had always been supportive, but this moment of shared vulnerability deepened the bond between them. They weren't just working together, they were fighting for the same thing, for the same reasons. He nodded, feeling a sense of determination settle in. "Thanks, Sarah. Let's make it happen." The next morning, the lab was buzzing with activity as the team prepared for the controlled test. Engineers and researchers moved swiftly between workstations, double-checking equipment, running last-minute diagnostics, and finalizing the safety protocols. Ethan stood by the main console, overseeing the setup, while Sarah coordinated with the other team members. As they worked, Ethan felt the familiar tension in the air. Everyone knew how critical this test was, not just for the project, but for the future of QuantumCore. If it went well, they'd be on the verge of a technological revolution. If it failed, the consequences could be disastrous. "Energy levels are holding steady," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos. She stood beside him, tablet in hand, monitoring the data in real time. "We're as ready as we'll ever be." Ethan nodded, his eyes locked on the quantum core, now housed within a reinforced containment field. The energy inside it was barely visible, but the potential it held was immense. "Let's initiate the test," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves buzzing beneath the surface. Sarah relayed the command to the team, and within moments, the room quieted as the system powered up. A soft hum filled the air as the quantum compression process began. On the main display, the energy levels slowly climbed, each increment carefully controlled and monitored. "Energy compression is stable," one of the engineers called out. "No anomalies detected." Ethan watched the data closely, his fingers hovering over the emergency shutdown switch. The energy was building, higher than they'd ever pushed it before, but the system held. For now. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The energy within the quantum core grew denser, more concentrated, and the soft glow in the containment field brightened. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the levels climb, inching toward the threshold they had set for the test. "We're approaching maximum compression," Sarah reported, her voice calm but focused. Ethan's gaze flicked to her. She was steady, as always. They had been through countless tests together, But this one felt different. This one felt like it could change everything. Suddenly, a warning light flashed on the console. "Energy flux detected," one of the engineers called out, his voice tense. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Where's it coming from?" "Localized in the core. Flux is increasing." Sarah's eyes widened as she scanned the data. "Shut it down, now!" Ethan didn't hesitate. He hit the shutdown switch, and the quantum core immediately powered down, the energy levels dropping rapidly. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick in the air. "Containment field is holding," another engineer reported, relief evident in his voice. Ethan exhaled, his body sagging with the release of adrenaline. "That was close." Sarah looked at him, her expression serious but calm. "We're fine. The system did what it was supposed to do. We shut it down before it could escalate." Ethan nodded, though the tension in his chest remained. They had avoided a catastrophe, but it had been too close for comfort. He glanced at the quantum core, now dim and quiet, and felt a weight settle on his shoulders. "We're not ready for a full-scale test," he said quietly. "Not yet." Sarah stood beside him, her gaze following his. But we're getting there." Later that evening, long after the rest of the team had left, Ethan and Sarah sat in the quiet lab, reviewing the data from the test. The quantum core sat in its containment field, dark and silent, but its presence loomed over them. "We were close," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "Closer than we've ever been." "Too close," Ethan replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "If that flux had increased just a little more." "But it didn't," she reminded him. "We shut it down. The system worked." He nodded, but the weight of the day still pressed on him. The potential for failure was always there, lurking beneath the surface of every breakthrough, and the stakes kept getting higher. "We'll run more simulations," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "We'll find the source of the flux and fix it. We're not giving up." Ethan looked at her, grateful for her unwavering support. "No, we're not." They sat in silence for a while, the glow of the computer screens casting soft shadows around them. Despite the setbacks, despite the pressure, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. They were on the brink of something incredible, something that could change the world. And he wasn't alone in this. Sarah glanced at him, a small smile on her face. "You're still with me, right?" He smiled back, the tension easing just a little. "Always." The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the city as Sarah Hale stepped out of her car and approached the front of Ethan's apartment building. The air was cool, crisp with the early hour, and the streets were quiet, still waking up to the new day. Today was important, a day they'd been working toward for months, and she thought it might be good to check in on Ethan before they headed into the lab. She reached the door to Ethan's apartment and knocked gently, stepping back and waiting for him to answer. While she waited, she looked around the quiet hallway, noting how peaceful it was at this time of the morning. The knock echoed softly, but no answer came right away. As she prepared to knock again, the door to an adjacent apartment creaked open, and out stepped Mrs. Green, just as Sarah had seen her do once before when she had visited Ethan in the past. Mrs. Green was carrying her usual warmth in her expression, a curious smile spreading across her face as she spotted Sarah. "Well, good morning," Mrs. Green greeted with a cheerful tone, her voice carrying easily in the quiet hallway. "You must be one of Ethan's friends." Sarah smiled politely, lowering her hand from the door. "Good morning. I'm Sarah, a colleague of Ethan's. We work together." Mrs. Green's eyes twinkled with mischief as she stepped a little closer, her hands clutching a small bag of groceries. "Oh, I see. Just a colleague, is it?" She winked playfully. "You're not his girlfriend, then?" The question caught Sarah off guard, but she smiled, amused by the older woman's light-hearted nosiness. "No, not his girlfriend. Just here to check in before we head to work." Mrs. Green let out a soft chuckle, clearly enjoying her role as the neighborhood busybody. Well, I've seen Ethan come and go all hours of the day and night, but I've never seen him bring a lovely young lady like you around before. Before Sarah could respond, the door to Ethan's apartment clicked open, and Ethan stood in the doorway, looking slightly amused as he caught the tail end of the conversation. "I heard that," Ethan said with a grin, leaning casually against the doorframe. "And no, Mrs. Green, Sarah's not my girlfriend. She's a colleague from work." Mrs. Green's expression was one of mock surprise as she looked between Ethan and Sarah. "Well, isn't that something? A beautiful young colleague coming to see you so early in the morning? I'd still say there's something special about that." Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Trust me, Mrs. Green, it's all work-related. We've got a big day ahead at QuantumCore." Mrs. Green nodded knowingly, but clearly wasn't convinced. "If you say so, dear. I suppose I'll let you two get on with your work then. But you be sure to stop by and say hello to an old lady every once in a while, Ethan. You don't want to neglect your neighbors." "I won't forget, Mrs. Green," Ethan replied warmly, glancing at Sarah with a shared look of amusement. "And we'll definitely stop by when things calm down." Mrs. Green gave a little wave, her smile softening as she started toward the elevator. "Good luck with your big day at work, both of you. Sounds like important business." Sarah smiled back at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Green. We'll need it." With Mrs. Green finally on her way, Ethan turned to Sarah, stepping aside and gesturing for her to come in. "You'd better come in before she decides to play matchmaker." Sarah laughed softly as she stepped into the apartment. "I don't think I'd stand a chance against her. She's sweet, though." "She is," Ethan agreed, closing the door behind them. "But she doesn't miss a thing. You wouldn't believe some of the stories she's told me." Ethan's apartment was just as Sarah remembered it from the last time she had been over. Modern, minimalistic, but comfortable. The soft morning light filtered in through the large windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. "So," Ethan began, motioning toward the small dining table near the window. "Coffee? I'm assuming you've already had your morning dose, but there's plenty if you need more." Sarah shook her head, smiling. "I'm good, thanks. I'm more here to make sure you're ready for today." Ethan leaned against the counter, folding his arms across his chest as he regarded her with a calm but thoughtful expression. "I've been ready. Doesn't mean I'm not thinking about all the things that could go wrong." Sarah nodded, walking over to stand near the window, looking out at the city below. The skyline was starting to come to life as the sun rose higher, painting the buildings in a soft golden glow. She understood the weight of what today meant, not just for Ethan, but for both of them. The stakes were incredibly high, and there was always that nagging voice in the back of her mind, wondering if they had prepared enough. "I get it," Sarah said, her tone softer now. "This is the big day. After everything we've put into this project, it feels like everything's riding on today." Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady but filled with a deeper understanding. "Yeah, everything we've worked for, all those late nights, all the testing, it all leads to this." Sarah turned to face him, her arms resting against the back of a chair. "But we're ready, Ethan. We've done everything we can to make sure this goes right. We're in control." Ethan gave a small, appreciative smile. "I know, and I appreciate you being here, this early and everything." Sarah smirked. "Well, you're not getting out of this that easily. We're in it together." Ethan chuckled softly. "I wouldn't dream of it." The quiet settled between them, the anticipation of the day ahead filling the room. Despite the pressure and the stakes, there was a sense of calm in that moment, a shared understanding that no matter what happened, they were in this together. "So," Ethan said after a pause, "what do you think?" "Head to the lab and make history?" Sarah nodded, her eyes glinting with determination. "Let's do it." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, there was a renewed sense of focus between them. Today was more than just another test. Today could be the start of something far bigger than either of them had imagined. And whatever happened, they would face it together. The air in the lab was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just another routine test. Today was the day, and the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. All eyes were on the quantum core, housed inside the shimmering containment field. Its soft hum, a deceptively calm presence amidst the buzzing energy in the room. From above, Mr. William Lennox and a team of military officials watched the proceedings from a high-rise control room that overlooked the lab. Encased in a protective shield, they were far removed from the immediate danger, their eyes trained on the events below. The weight of their presence pressed down on Ethan's team, an invisible force that made every breath feel heavier, every action more critical. Ethan stood by the main console, his mind racing with the 1,000 variables that could go wrong. His fingers hovered over the controls, ready to guide his team through the most ambitious test of their lives. Next to him, Sarah Hale stood poised, her eyes flicking between the screens, monitoring every detail with precision. She felt the pressure too, but she had always been able to keep her cool, something Ethan admired about her. The calm before the storm was palpable. In the corner, the rest of the team moved with purpose, running final diagnostics, checking and rechecking every piece of equipment, knowing there was no room for error today. The military officers, stiff in their uniforms, observed silently from above. Ethan could feel their expectations pressing in on him. This wasn't just about science anymore. This was about power, contracts, and control. Suddenly, Lennox's voice cut through the intercom. It was steady, almost too casual for the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Cross, we're ready when you are. Let's get this show on the road." Ethan glanced at Sarah, his face betraying none of the anxiety gnawing at his insides. "Here we go," he muttered, his voice low. Sarah nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "We've prepared for this. Let's make it count." Ethan took a deep breath, fingers brushing over the console. "Initiating sequence," he announced, loud enough for everyone in the lab to hear. The quantum core hummed louder, its internal energy beginning to gather as the compression process started. Monitors blinked to life across the room, displaying streams of data in real time. Every eye in the lab was on those numbers, watching for any sign of deviation, any hint of trouble. For the first few minutes, everything was smooth. The energy levels climbed steadily, just as they had during the smaller, controlled tests. Ethan watched the screens, his heart pounding in sync with the steady rise of the core's energy. "We're approaching the initial threshold," Sarah reported, her voice professional, but tinged with the slightest edge of nerves. "Everything's stable." Ethan exhaled a small breath of relief. So far, so good. He could feel the tension in the room ease ever so slightly. His team members, huddled around their workstations, exchanged cautious glances. They were on the verge of something extraordinary, if they could just hold this course. He glanced up at the high-rise, where Lennox and the military officials stood watching. Even from this distance, Ethan could feel the weight of their scrutiny. They were expecting results, no matter the risks. But then, just as the core reached the critical point of compression, something shifted, a flicker on the monitor. The numbers wavered, subtle, but enough to send a chill through Ethan's body. "Wait a second," Ethan muttered, frowning at the data. "That's not right." Sarah's eyes darted to her own screen, her brow furrowing. "Energy flux detected. It's climbing faster than projected." Ethan's heart quickened. That shouldn't be happening. The stabilizers should have compensated. The quantum core's glow began to intensify, the energy inside it building too quickly, too aggressively. The containment field shimmered, and for a moment, it flickered. Ethan's stomach dropped. He slammed his hands on the console. "Shut it down, now!" Sarah's fingers flew over the controls, but the alarm started blaring before she could react. Red lights flashed across the lab, and the hum of the core shifted into a dangerous, unstable roar. "It's not responding!" Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "I'm locked out!" The core pulsed violently, sending a ripple of raw energy through the lab. Ethan could feel it vibrating beneath his feet, a powerful wave that shook the equipment and rattled the walls. Panic spread like wildfire through the team. "Containment breach imminent," one of the engineers yelled, backing away from the core in a panic. "We need to evacuate," another called, already heading for the door. But Ethan's mind raced with 1,000 calculations. The quantum core was moments away from breaching, and if it did, the explosion would be catastrophic. The entire lab, maybe the entire building, would be lost. But more than that, the energy contained within the core could cause unimaginable destruction. "No!" Ethan shouted, stepping forward. "Everyone get back! I have to shut it down manually!" Sarah's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across her face. "Ethan, no, you can't! There's no time! We need to get out of here!" Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. "I have to! It's the only way!" The quantum core pulsed again, stronger this time. The containment field shimmered, barely holding the raw energy inside. The hum had turned into a high-pitched whine, and Ethan knew they only had seconds before it reached critical. Without another word, Ethan turned to Sarah, his expression firm but calm. He reached out, gently gripping her shoulders and nudging her toward the door. "Get out of here, Sarah," he said, his voice softer now, but filled with resolve. "Take the others. I can do this." Sarah's face tightened with fear, her eyes locking onto his. "No, Ethan, I'm not leaving you in here. We can find another way." Ethan shook his head, his hands lingering on her shoulders for a moment longer, before he pushed her gently toward the exit. "Go. You need to get them to safety. I'll shut it down." Tears of frustration welled in Sarah's eyes, but she could see the determination in his face. She hesitated for a heartbeat, torn between staying by his side and following his order. But the whine of the core grew louder, and she knew there was no time left. "Ethan!" Her voice cracked with emotion. "I'll be fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Trust me, get out." With a pained expression, Sarah took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. "I'll come back for you." "I know," Ethan said, already turning back toward the core. "Now go." Sarah hesitated one last time before turning and running toward the exit, shouting for the remaining team members to follow her. The lab was descending into chaos, the alarms blaring, red lights casting everything in a harsh glow. But Ethan didn't have time to worry about that. He sprinted toward the core, the energy inside it glowing hotter, brighter, the containment field flickering dangerously. His heart raced as he reached the manual controls near the core, his hands trembling as he tried to override the system. Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth, his fingers flying over the controls. But the system wasn't responding. Every override command he entered was rejected, the energy flux too high, too volatile. Up in the high-rise, Lennox and the military officers watched in tense silence, their protective shield keeping them safe, while the lab below teetered on the edge of disaster. "Mr. Cross, shut it down now!" Lennox's voice boomed over the intercom, laced with the first hints of fear. Ethan barely heard him. His entire focus was on the core. The energy was reaching critical levels, the containment field seconds away from failure. He had to do something, anything, to stop it. But before he could react, there was a deafening crack, and the containment field shattered, sending a massive shockwave through the lab. The explosion of raw energy slammed into Ethan with the force of a freight train, lifting him off his feet and throwing him across the room. He hit the ground hard, his body skidding across the floor before coming to a stop. Pain exploded through him, but it was drowned out by a strange sensation, a pulsing electric current that coursed through his veins. He could feel the energy from the core surging inside him, filling him with a power that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Everything around him was a blur of smoke, debris, and chaos. Alarms blared in the distance, voices shouted in panic, but Ethan couldn't focus on any of it. His body felt different. It buzzed with energy, like every cell in his body was vibrating at a frequency he couldn't understand. Through the smoke and haze, he saw a figure running toward him. Sarah. "Ethan!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic as she dropped to her knees beside him. "Ethan, can you hear me?"